Welcome to Read, Think, Act. Today we'll be hearing from Emily Kenway, author of The Truth About Modern Slavery.
So the term modern slavery is an umbrella term for lots of severely exploitative situations like human trafficking, forced labor, domestic servitude. But it's not just a term meaning those things. It also makes us think in particular ways about severe exploitation, namely that awful working conditions are an anomaly to the general system that we live within. So they're exceptional, they're an aberration, and they're caused by these individual deviant criminals rather than anything structural. So it teaches us a kind of storybook version of exploitation in which a bad villain enslaves or ensnares an innocent victim, and then hopefully a hero comes along and rescues that victim and liberates them into freedom. And we see a lot of this kind of language from politicians, from media, and from some campaigns on this issue. Fundamentally, that story, that fairy tale, is depoliticized, right? It's not about politics. It's not about the choices of governments. It's about a few bad apples. And we hear politicians repeating that this is an issue above the fray of party politics. Now, in reality, people experience exploitation because they've been made vulnerable by the structures that shape our lives. A really clear and simple way of thinking about it is if I come along to you and I say, I've got a job for you, it's £2 an hour, it's 10 hours a day, and I'll give you accommodation, but there's no central heating or hot water. You're going to say no if you've got a better option, which many people do. But the reality of our economy around the world today is that a substantial proportion of people have no better option than bad work. So when we hear about modern slaves lured or duped into their situation, we're hearing a story that's about kind of persuasion and ignorance almost, rather than what their socioeconomic situation was originally that meant they needed to say yes to that bad offer or yes to getting into that lorry. So in essence, it gives us this individualist, criminological, moral storyline, rather than one about vulnerability, exploitation, and the political choices that cause those things. What we know about the world is kind of an interplay of our material reality and then our ideas and how we can express our interactions with the world. So our language, basically. And so the ideas and language we have are a really vital part of how we live and the choices we make. There's a writer called Walter Lippmann who, in his 1922 book, Public Opinion, said that the ways in which the world is imagined determines at any particular moment what people will do. And for me, that really encompasses how we need to think about language and also the phrase modern slavery. So the metaphors and terms that we use to think about and describe something delimit, curtail, constrain the ways that we can imagine that thing, and therefore the ways we can imagine changing it. There's loads of really clear examples that aren't even from this terrain. For example, the idea of a borderless world, the idea of not having police, all of these ideas seem really kind of outlandish because they're outside our current common sense imagination. In the modern slavery story, there are lots of different ways that this plays out. But just one example is with big brands. When we see them talking about exploitation in their supply chains, they will tend to talk about it as an anomaly. So as this kind of accidental contamination that they're going to go in, extricate, and then everything will carry on and be hunky-dory. This shapes the tools that they use to tackle that exploitation. So they'll tend towards things like apps and training managers to spot the signs of slaves, right? As if it's a kind of splinter in a foot that you can just pluck out. Now, that makes sense if you think that modern slavery is caused by individual deviant actors intervening in the supply chain. But if you understand that exploitation occurs because of deep systemic factors and is actually embedded in that corporate supply chain structure, so it's, for example, part of the reason why they're citing their factories in countries with very low labor rights. Part of the reason that we have so much exploitation in supply chains is the poor prices paid to suppliers. So it's these like business model factors that have that cause and effect creating exploitation. Once you understand that, it really doesn't make sense to like scan for the anomaly. Instead, you're looking at how do we change those cogs? How do we alter the machine itself so the output is different? My first rule of thumb whenever anyone asks me, how can I help, is to make sure that whatever you're doing is not assuming that people who experience exploitation are in some way ignorant and it's not infantilizing them. We see around the world a lot of campaigns and interventions that have a kind of white savior aspect, and make a very strange assumption that people have been just, have stupidly walked into this exploitative situation rather than they had an array of core options and they selected one of them. If we think about migration policy, for example, most human trafficking across borders today is migration gone wrong, right? It's not abduction. And so what we can immediately see there is that that was a person making a rational choice of what was available because there were no safe and legal pathways. So that should be a rule of thumb for any kind of involvement. And for me, what that boils down to is getting involved in things that are about rights and resources, right? That's fundamentally respecting the human at the heart of each of these stories. With immigration, which is an area, where people are highly vulnerable to exploitation because of the hostile environment, there's a number of amazing organizations. I always recommend supporting the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants, who do a lot of work to fight the Home Office's disgusting policies. Likewise, Women for Refugee Women do amazing work, and Bail in Detention, who actually work really hard to get victims of trafficking out of immigration jails where they should never be in the first place. And of course, direct action trying to stop raids in your local area is a really important facet of this as well. With regard to work more broadly, I strongly believe we all need to become kind of advocates and almost like brand managers for trade unions. We need to be out there countering the long-standing maligning of trade unions and explaining to people, many of whom, especially younger people, may never have heard these things, what trade unions want us in the first place and why they're important. Fundamentally, it's coming together to protect your rights, and that's really important. So unions are definitely part of the answer. And then a final thing I'd say is that the sex industry is possibly hardest hit by those very problematic anti-trafficking, anti-modern slavery campaigns that I described, the kind of infantilizing ones, because the whole industry and all the women in it are treated as if they're all victims rather than people making choices out of possibly a bad array of choices that isn't, it's because of the economic system that we're in. We absolutely have to decriminalize the sex industry so that people in there have rights, and so that we can tackle the exploitation that happens in there by ensuring that those rights and access to justice exists. So I always recommend supporting Swarm, who do amazing work, and also Decrim Now, which is a UK-wide campaign to decriminalise sex work and make sure sex workers have the rights and respect that they need.